Dankeschön. So, as a creative person, I never really cared much for numbers or data, but nowadays you can't ignore it. Data is everywhere. We have the means to store and process huge amounts of data. There's only one small problem, and that is that we humans aren't wired to process large amounts of data. And so as a designer, I sort of see my mission to make numbers tangible now. And so I want to tell a story today with data, and that's about forest fires in Portugal. And that's going to be my showcase, and yeah, I'll take you there. So last year there were about 130,000 forest fires in Europe, destroying close to 1 million hectares of land. And that's equivalent to 1.36 million of soccer fields, which I think is quite a lot. In Portugal alone, there were 85,000 hectares that burned, and that's equivalent to 10% of continental Portugal. There was one big fire in Pedrógão Grande last year, and in that fire, it cost a lot of money, 800 million euro in losses were recorded. And to make that number more tangible, that's about 46,000 times the gross disposable income, household income per capita in Portugal, and that's about every 111th person working for an entire year without getting paid. So, of course, money can't compensate certain things, and particularly not the loss of family or friends. And so my question was, what do we do if there's a fire close by and if it's threatening? So nature equipped us with this fight or flight mode, and so the first reaction is to escape, to try to get away. And that's what happened, that's what a lot of people did. And in that one fire, there were 65 people that died, and most of them when they were trying to escape the flames on the national road. So I wondered, what could you do with data? Because I love technology if it's done right. I love data. I've worked with many great data scientists. And I think you can do a lot, because data reflects reality, and at the same time, it gives you a very different way of looking at the world, because, as I said, we could never take in all these numbers if we weren't to visualize it and make the data more accessible. So I started to look for I did secondary research to look for the breadth of this topic, so what is involved. And, of course, climate scientists say that global warming is creating more favorable conditions with longer summers and drier winters. Some people say, particularly in Portugal, that it's the eucalyptus companies that are trying to get the small farmers out of the way to create bigger, more efficient plantations. And eucalyptus trees, because they have so many essential oils, they basically explode when they start to burn. And then also some people said because of the financial crisis, Portugal doesn't have the funds to do the aviation firefighting by their own means, so they contract, they are in the hands of contracts and of external companies, and some say that they even set the fires because they want basically their contracts to be prolonged. So I started to look for data to see what I could see, and if I could define or if I could find patterns in the data that would give me some sort of clue how you could solve or how you could address this issue. And so I collected data from the National Protection Agency. We wrote some scripts to, create a history of that data. And when I looked at it, it looked like this. You can basically see here from the beginning of 2017 all the way to last month. the number of fires that were reported, so all the 112 calls that come in are captured here. And in one day alone, that was October 15, there were 563 fires. And so when you look at the data, you think, oh my God, there were only 3 periods where these people had a break. And because I am the owner, or I have the data in hand, I wanted to know, was that really the case? And I discovered that the absence of data and making it transparent that there is a lack of data is just as important as the data itself. So looking at it in a different way, I had to change the data collection process again. I had to get some hand on the metadata of my data so that I could understand how many errors there are, what kind of errors there are, how many times we try to get the data but the service was not available, things like that. And so looking at it this way, you could quite easily see that there were 3 periods where there was no data available. And that's really important to interpret this, because it could be there was no fire or we simply had no information. Looking at the data in a different way, this is per month the fire incidents on a map, immediately gives a much more emotional display, and it also answers a different question. For example, how am I affected? Maybe I live in this region or I have friends there. And so the way we display data totally depends on what kind of question we want to ask. And what I continued then after seeing this was trying to see, juxtapose or complement this information with weather data. And so again, we wrote another Python script to collect a weather history. And what you see here is, again, per month, all the fire incidents. And on this side, you see per row is one location. And so for an entire month and 62 locations, you can see temperatures, wind, and rain information. And that information I chose because in my research I learned that those are factors that strongly influence how fire spreads. So my initial vision or my goal is to actually create predictions that tell you how a fire will spread once it's started. So I'm going to flip through a year and a half of weather data and fire data just to give you an impression what kind of power visualization has. And obviously we could never consume this in any other way, like looking at numbers would just not be possible. So, and you can see if you find any patterns there. So you can see in March already temperatures are getting much hotter. There are more fires. Is this moving? Yes. Then June, that was the month where the fire in Pedrógão Grande was, and you see that the temperatures are getting pretty high. If you watch the rain chart, you can see that there is like almost no rain for the entire year. You can also discover the lack of data, so when there's data missing. And so I looked and I browsed through all this data and just to see if I could see any correlation. Here, this is an interesting month. This year in June, like this stripe pattern, where does it come from? And why don't we have any information about the rain? And these are important questions when you represent information in a visual way to expose this kind of these patterns, or to investigate where the patterns come from and then expose that to people as well. So looking at a year and a half of fire and weather history, I felt that there wasn't such a strong correlation. Like, for example, at the beginning of this year, the temperatures were pretty moderate, but there's still a peak in the fire incidents. Maybe one thing that becomes apparent is that last year, hot temperatures started already in April, and they went like all the way through December, while the whole time there was basically no precipitation, and so everything was extremely dry. Looking at it again from a different perspective, this now shows the whole year and a half of fire history in one picture, and you can see a diagonal line, so there seems to be some pattern, and knowing that in central and northern Portugal there's a lot of eucalyptus and pine plantations, it sort of makes sense because, obviously that's a lot of material to burn. If you look at this chart on the right side, that's the population density, and that suggests that, or at least it shows a correlation between the number of fires or the occurrences of fires and the population density. So why am I doing this, or why was I doing this? Just to look at the data and see if there are other questions that sort of emerge once you see what's going on. And so I did this, and I thought, let me go back to Portugal and try to ask users or people that live in the area if this is in any way helpful to them. And what happened then is we have a little valley there, and we were sitting in our valley, and the whole day there were like smoke, and you could smell it. There were fires going on, and of course I saw it in my dashboard. And at one point I walked up because I was always having like an eye on it because, I tend to panic. And so at one point I turned around and I saw that the fire or the smoke was really close, and my husband was making pancakes and at the time, and I ran into the kitchen and said, fuck the pancakes, we gotta get out. And so we grabbed our bag and got into the car, and I was like hyperventilating and trying to stay calm, but I was like totally, it was a really weird feeling. And so we were, and you can imagine it's a valley with one street, so there's only one way out. So I wanted to get to the next village where there's at least options in terms of which direction you can go. But as we were driving there, we saw that it kept getting worse, and we couldn't get through because the protection agency had blocked the road. And so we had to go back towards where the fire came from. So in the late afternoon, it looked like this. At night, it looked like this. We were in a building where a bunch of people gathered, and someone said, Sandra, don't panic. I'm like, okay, I'll try. It was really hard, and as soon as I wanted to calm down a little bit, someone was shouting, we gotta get out, it's not safe. Okay, so we got out, and as I was walking, we were walking towards this church, and you can see like the fire was coming from all sides down the hill. And as I was walking there, I thought, we're never gonna make it, because everything was bright orange. There were burning pine cones flying through the air. There was no air to breathe anymore. And the pine cones were setting fires inside of the village, houses inside of the village on fire. So the next day, it looked like this. We made it. The guys were very brave. They were, trying to protect the church with water from the outside. I was taking down the curtains on the inside, sticking them into the toilet, into the sink, everywhere where there was water, just to close up all the holes to keep the smoke out. And we made it. 42 people, again, weren't lucky enough, they didn't make it, and it looked like this. And while this picture might look dramatic, it doesn't even capture it, because the worst thing was that like vicious smell of everything that burned. And so the communication infrastructure was hit as well, and so all we had left was storytelling. So people eventually tried the roads, you were talking and communicating where it's safe. And I took the opportunity to capture the stories, and everybody was really willing to share what they had experienced that night. And back in Germany, I synthesized all the interviews and all the results, and I came up with 3 main themes that emerged. And one is fire is moving. You know, that sounds like a no-brainer, but the National Protection Agency only captures the data where it has been recorded, so where the 112 call comes in. But fire moves with wind and all sorts of other factors, and so an hour, 2 hours later, you know, that reference point is not that valuable anymore. The other thing is that people don't have reliable information because everybody posts on Facebook, but they're not always capable of giving good information. They don't know, is it north or is it south? They don't know the names of the locations and so on. And so one person told me that they sent the firefighters in the completely wrong direction, and then it took a lot of time, and that's valuable time. And then the last one is that without communication, chaos breaks out, because I mean, that whole night I didn't see a single firefighter. We were just left in that village on our own. And we organized civilian firefighting. So like I said, brave guys with water tanks and water pumps and pickup trucks that went up to help the people and the villagers. So, but if that's not possible anymore, then nothing can be done. So again, I ask myself, coming from a technology background, how can we support the decisions that people make so they don't get on the wrong roads, things like that, with data. And yes, then the next thing, of course, is to try to get the data. There's different data sources that I want to combine. The 112 calls already mentioned, then weather services from the cloud, and then there's satellite imagery. And satellite images are like a wonderful thing. The ESA provides all this imagery for free, and you can get the data of the red and the near-infrared reflectance and calculate a so-called NDVI, normalized difference vegetation index. And what you can do with this is you can assess the vegetation's moisture content, but also you can discriminate plant species. So depending on what grows on the earth has a very big impact on how fire moves. But then also user data, you know, so they can get more current information that people can easily report a fire or roadblock or a location where people are gathering for shelter. And using automatically captured data from the mobile devices can mitigate the misinformation because people are not capable to provide good location information. Sensor data is also a really good source of information because every time that it's automated, it sort of makes the process a little easier. So for example, smoke detection sensors could be arranged around like sensible communication infrastructure so that the firefighters can protect that, because if that goes down, everything else goes down with it. So I created a prototype. I wanted to create a very simple user experience that even in a stressful situation and under the influence of massive amounts of adrenaline, still helps people to interpret and to make better decisions. So what you see on the left side, it looks a little funny because it's a functional prototype. So what you see on the left is basically a fire map that shows fire locations with the red dots, indicating the amount of firefighters, which is sort of an indicator of how big a fire is in the color intensity. So the darker the dots, the more firefighters on site. And then you have wind speed and wind direction represented in the size and the angle of the pizza slices. And then this green square is my first attempt to analyze the satellite data. So what you see here is basically where there is forest. So forest is not very specific, but it's a first attempt. And we will work further on this to actually discriminate plants. In the middle, you see what you get when you click on one of the fire incidents. You get contextual information, but also weather forecast, so a 12-hour weather forecast, so you can see, is the wind picking up or is the direction of the wind changing? Those are all interesting or valuable information pieces to then decide where to go. And on the right side, there's easy ways for people to report a roadblock and things like that. So, and that information, of course, then also goes onto the fire map. So would we have known that when we were trying to escape that the road was blocked, we would have never gotten into the car, because it's a very scary feeling if you drive and on the left and on the right it's burning, and I was thinking, if our tires melt, then what are we going to do? Oh, there's one more, okay. So, but then the question is, can we trust the data? Like, as I showed earlier in the simple example with the missing information, we really need to expose the uncertainties in the data. So why do we need to do this? Because we want to prevent people from drawing the wrong conclusions. So that's why we need to characterize what type of uncertainty it is and what the size of the uncertainty is. Okay, so the next screens are not for people in the fire situations. They're just sketches and concepts for how we can represent the uncertainties in the data. So looking at errors and missing data to get an idea how reliable our services are and how many errors there are. Looking at value ranges in the data so we can see within an hour like what was the minimum and what was the maximum of fire incidents reported. Or like in this wind visualization, every dot represents one location, and you can see if there are outliers that have a particularly strong wind, things like that. And again, looking at the rain, there's hardly any. And last, I call it AI monitoring, because from my experience, even with all the artificial intelligence apps, people do want to be in control, and they want to understand how good the quality of our predictions are. So how does the temperatures, for example, compare, the predictions compare to reality, and how good are the forecasts, how much do they deviate from the truth? Or in terms of classifying satellite data, we need to understand we need to do the ground truth. So all these pink dots here represent the ground truth, and we can use it to make an assessment of how good our classifications are. These kind of screens are more for like a service and support kind of person, so someone who controls the system and ensures that, that it's working right and that the data is in good shape. For users, of course, in the field, trying to get a quick assessment, and this is on purpose that it's so simple with just the gauges. But what kind of answers they should answer are really, are there errors or holes in the data making our system weak? How good are our weather forecasts? Like, are we like over or underestimating temperature, wind, and things like that? And then the last one would be just a simple representation of how good our classification is. So the message or the moral of this story is really every day we produce 2.5 quintillion bytes of data according to Forbes magazine. That's a number that I can't even, obviously I can't comprehend it. I just know that it's a lot. And the message is, if we have so much data, I think we should use it for something that actually creates value with people. I think we should tell stories with data. Thank you.